Good evening and welcome to my How Healthy Are You weekly educational call. My name is Dr. Thomas Brewer. I'm a PhD chemist. I'm going to begin this evening's call with some coronavirus facts that is not accessible to most of the public. I got this information from a very good source. His name's Dr. Brewer, and he researches many peer-reviewed journal articles. So this is scientific research results, and these results have been trickling out the past few months. This is the information that doctors and PhD scientists will read, but a journalist will not even look at this information. It's usually written with a lot of scientific jargon, and it's hard to understand. So I'm going to go back with a little bit of history about coronavirus type viruses. It's a big category of viruses, and new ones are constantly seen in all livestock. And it usually takes just a few years and a new coronavirus type virus is seen in livestock. People thought, well, it was just pigs or bats, but they're seen in chickens and cattle and camels, pretty much all livestock. The interesting thing is normally a coronavirus does not typically jump to humans. They're normally staying within the same animal that they're found in, and there's a lot of them known. However, coronaviruses are known to mutate, so they do change. And previously, what happened most of the time is they would mutate but still stay in the same livestock or go from livestock to livestock, like from chickens to cattle and things like that. So this classification of viruses does mutate, and it seems to mutate when it's exposed to a different host, and then it mutates so that it can affect the different host. If we go way back in history, the first coronavirus was found in chickens. At least the source was chickens, and this was in 1931. The scary thing is there is a new coronavirus out right now. It's in livestock, and it has the acronym SADS, or SADS. It has not jumped to humans yet. If you remember, and if you looked at last week's newsletter, I put a file in there of all my previous topics, and you'll see that back in January, I talked about COVID-19 as a new coronavirus. So I'm telling you now, there's something called SADS. Hasn't jumped to humans yet, but there is a risk that it will. If we're going to have more and more of these pandemics, this is most likely the next one. I hate to say this, but this isn't over yet. Many corona-type viruses do result in the common cold. So coronaviruses have been around, like I said, since 1931, and they typically are linked to a particular common cold. Unfortunately, we've never developed a vaccine for any coronavirus that resulted in a common cold, let alone what's happening now with COVID-19. So continuing with this information about the past and the history, if we go up to more recent history, what we've been doing for few months now is social distancing. And China did this first when they realized they had a problem with COVID-19. And it's considered a very old school type response where you just shut everything down. And they did that, and they were very strict about it, and the global community thought they were overreacting. But if we look at the data now that's being published in journal articles, it really did reduce the spread of the disease, of the virus. So it essentially worked, but it's very draconian what they were doing. They weren't letting people leave their house, and they could only leave for 20 minutes every 2 days. It was very rough. Ours was not as serious as China's. Now, what they were doing is they were trying to contain the virus. They knew there was a big problem. So once containment fails, then what we started doing, and we never did contain the virus, we did social distancing and locking down most behavior, but not all. The concept you remember hearing in the news was to flatten the curve. Everyone's heard this, I'm sure. As a scientist and with all the math I've had, this concept doesn't change much because the area under the curve, meaning the number of people catching the virus, is pretty much constant. What flattening the curve does is it does not make a large strain on the hospital. So you don't have a large number of people catching COVID-19, getting seriously ill, and having to go to the hospital all at once. So it just spreads the number of people that have to be admitted to hospitals. But it doesn't really change the total number that much. And that's where we are, and that's the logic behind flattening the curve. The area under a very steep curve or a very flat curve is identical, and the area is the number of people infected. So another thing we found out from analyzing the data is children aren't really the main carrier of COVID-19. And what most every country did is they closed down their schools. And in the process of closing down their schools, it affected the healthcare workers that had to stay home, and perhaps they couldn't find babysitters, or you probably couldn't even use a babysitter at that time because no one was allowed to be around someone. So the loss of healthcare workers was actually worse than having the children stay in school, because we didn't know they weren't going to be main carriers. So this is hindsight, but it may be important when and if this happens again, especially if SADS or SADS is our next turn at dealing with a pandemic. Now, Asian countries have been pretty good dealing with COVID-19, and the reason is they had SARS back in 2002. They had something called MERS, M-E-R-S, in 2012. So they had a lot more experience than the United States. Now we have experience, so we will probably be better if we run into something like this again. So looking at more recent information and really important information for everybody on this call, the numbers we thought weren't quite right with respect to how many days you would be contagious without showing symptoms. So essentially you were sick, you had the virus, but you didn't know you did. That number is 5 days. It's not 12 days. The 12 came because a lot of people were reporting it later, but the data now shows it's 5 days that people don't show symptoms. The term would be asymptomatic at that point. The most common symptoms is when it starts, when you catch COVID-19, it's fever and cough. So that's 90% of the people start off with fever and cough. Now, more symptoms are possible, body aches and sneezing and all sorts of symptoms that you would have with pretty much any flu, because remember, coronavirus normally gave symptoms of a common cold. That's its history. So if people reach the stage and their symptom is difficulty breathing, that typically happens within a week, and we found this with the older people, and that's why there was need for them to go to the hospital. And that's absolutely true. That's what happened. But the numbers are very shocking as to really how many people die from COVID-19. So this is going to be shocking, folks. The numbers vary from 1 in 1,000 down to 1 in 300, and the worst number is 1 in 150. So 1 out of 100 would be 1%. So this is 0.75%, I believe. It's under 1%. What amazing. And if you look back in some of my previous conference calls, I said that these numbers that were showing up at 10% kill rate, 5% kill rate, and 2%, those were all high. The numbers are really low. I mean, because there was a study done, it was 1 in 1,000. So that'd be 0.1%. Of the people that catch coronavirus, 80% have very mild symptoms. And mild goes all the way up to having something similar to walking pneumonia type symptoms. But for a flu, that's all the way up to relatively mild symptoms. 80%. 15% of the people have severe symptoms, 5% critical. The critical is the difficulty breathing and needing to go to the hospital. And again, if the numbers are large, 5% of people that get infected going to the hospital, that's huge, and it would be a burden on the hospitals. But so far in this country, we haven't had any issues at hospitals. I've spoken to numerous hospital personnel, and people are afraid to go to the hospital. So we will see what happens in the future, but this gets you caught up to date. So I'm going to open up the call to questions. There we go. I know there's a lot of people on the call. So do we have any questions for this evening's call?
I would have a question about it seems like there's a few people around who have to take extra salt, so their salt because their salt blood test is too low, and just wonder if you had any advice on that or any way to help without taking too much salt.
Yeah, I do. That's an electrolyte issue. Typically happens in the summer. And what I recommend is just having a stalk of celery. So because you'll get that essentially salt substitute, but it won't raise your blood pressure, because when you ingest too much salt, and what we do is we always overshoot. If we're we don't have enough salt, then we take in too much. Each grain of salt and each sodium chloride ion surrounds itself by 6 molecules of water. So it's 6 to 1 water to salt. It's just sucking water around your body and out of your body, out of your tissues. And all that water makes your blood heavy and harder to pump, and that's why people's blood pressure goes up when their salt intake is too high. And a lot of people don't realize that. They just thought there was just some magic. You take in too much salt and your blood pressure goes up. But the reason is there's too much water in your blood. So the way to not have that occur is just to eat celery.
Well, would that work for someone? It was like my wife. One time she ended up in the hospital with low salt. And since then, she takes about 3 or 4 capsules of salt each day just to keep up, besides salting her food. And she likes to use Celtic or some type of salt with that mineral in it. So she has to just take a lot of salt just to maintain, or if she don't, she gets into trouble.
Right. But if that's what she needs, that's what she needs. It shouldn't be a problem.
She doesn't seem to have a problem with high blood pressure or anything like that.
Yeah. I mean, she might be, is it magnesium and potassium is what she needs? And not sodium as much?
Well, the sodium is the problem. It stays a little below normal even if she takes a lot of salt. Her chloride is a little low and sodium.
Right.
Not real low if she takes all the salt, It takes a lot of salt.
Yeah, I still think she should eat more celery.
Okay.
That should help her not need as many salt capsules.
Yes.
So
I last week or somewhere along the way, I asked about the kind of juicer you had, and I went to find one and all, and they seem to be sold out.
That makes sense.
About the time of the coronavirus thing and all. Anyway, they couldn't. I don't think they even had them on the internet. I mean, it was just I went into one store and finally a lady told me about them. Yeah, they had them, but they're gone.
I can give you the name of mine. It's called Omega, Omega. That's the brand, and it's very good for celery.
Well, they said that there was a Omega brand there, but I think it was $240 or something. They said this other one that's called the Juicer or something like that for about $99.
Right.
So I don't.
You want something with like a screw. Versus a spinning blade.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I thank you for your information.
Sure. Do we have any other questions or comments? I guess not. Well, I'd like to thank you for your attention. If you've made it this far, you essentially show your interest with your time, and I appreciate that. I'll be doing another call next week. Until then, stay safe and stay healthy. Okay, good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.